Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Kalpa here, Kalpa Gupta. She has created an organization that I think is extremely powerful, and I have invited her here to discuss what they do. We actually met during pandemic at an Elevate group gathering. I think Elevate and a few other organizations were going online at the time, trying to facilitate community. And I wanted to ask you first, Kalpa, to kind of describe what your life was like during the beginning of pandemic and how it transitioned.
So the beginning of pandemic, I was in a product role. I was a director leading one of the product management for small businesses, and I would say I was feeling pretty good. And you know why? And I was blessed and privileged. Is my in-laws were here with us. So as immigrants, we were not worrying about how a lot of people were worried, as you know, how their elderly and aging parents are far away. Of course, my parents were in India, and we were lucky that our son's school, he went to a charter school back then. You know, they had online learning. So it started out, of course, we all have anxieties, and we'll get into that in this conversation. But I had done a lot of the work in my own healing and just being mindful in my own life's, learnings. So I honestly was relatively feeling okay. I think as the endemic continued, and we started feeling the productivity pressure and the never tuning off and all of that, and just add to that, like, not just three jobs, which is like being having your job, being a parent, being another glue for the family. I felt like I was also becoming the teacher, and I wasn't prepared for that. Right.
Yeah.
For especially my son was like 6, so my mental state or work-wise was okay because I had the flexibility and I was anywhere remote worker for most parts. Things changed as pandemic evolved.
I think that resonates with a lot of people. The beginning, we were unsure of how things were really going to turn out. And then as it dragged on, people's anxiety started to increase, and we started reaching out different ways of connecting to each other. And like I mentioned, we had met through Elevate, which is a group for women in either entrepreneurial or even corporate settings for us to connect and kind of share ideas with each other. I know that you had a pretty big career change during this pandemic. Can you kind of walk us through what that change was and what your group now does?
Yes, so I think the big career change, it may seem big on the outset, but I think the transition quite honestly started 4 years ago, perhaps, or even 5 years ago now. I had left a corporate job and I was doing a lot of soul searching. So I created this company, KneKxt, as in what's next for Kalpa, right? From that, and then connecting with myself deeply. So as I felt like I was feeling lonely and disconnected, both as a rising leader in corporate America, as well as an immigrant, as a mom, as a wife, and all of the pieces of me. And what I had realized back then was I had trauma. I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and I had certain pattern that I was reenacting, and as a result, a lot of the same and a lot of the workplace kind of toxicity, I was like, it just has had a very traumatic effect on me, right? So fast forward from there on, like when last year, on the surface, for many of you it might appear that I created the company. Then my company where I was working, they did a restructuring, and honestly, when they did that happened like 2021 early January. I knew this was not long term. Like I, in fact, was getting like a year and a half into the role. I knew that my path was different, right? So pandemic happened. The restructuring happened. It did not have that same impact that my career transition had like 4 years ago, right? So for our audience, really what I do right now, I'm a consultant and coach, and I create safe spaces where executives and business owners who are trauma survivors, who might be hiding behind their achievements, who still have their identity stuck in shame, blame, and guilt. I shift them so they can show up boldly. Their inner child is seen, and we feel whole. So that's what I do. I also, so in that role, I work also with companies. Given my prior experience in financial services and product and risk management, and early career in research and consulting, I advise companies. So I have corporate clients as well. And then two, I also work individually with leaders and business owners. And three, I also do some group coaching, and I have some clients there where I help them show up more authentically in their lives.
That's really great. And I think, something that we kind of briefly chatted about before we started this conversation is there was not a lot of positives to come out of the pandemic, but kind of this wave of, like you mentioned, authenticity or bringing your full self to work, that has gotten a lot more attention, I believe, from people. And people started to feel maybe their trauma showing up at work in different ways, or maybe it had always been there, but they hadn't identified it as trauma. But when they had the time to actually analyze themselves, then they thought, oh, that's my trauma showing up. That's something that I really need to deal with. What are some examples of ways that you've seen trauma at work kind of unexpectedly show up, or people that maybe didn't even know that trauma was impacting their work?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So, and one of the great books in this healing journey is The Drama of the Gifted Child. This book is always like my reference point, like for all the time. I don't know how many times I see it through the day and week. One of the things around trauma is we sometimes hide behind, either sometimes people get addicted, which could be drugs or alcohol, or other sex or men or women, and one of the coping mechanisms is also achievement, because when trauma happens, you become hyper vigilant, controlling. And so my hypothesis, and this is backed by data, that a lot of the leaders are also trauma survivors in their own ways, and they may have had adverse childhood experiences, in terms of abuse and neglect, or household dysfunction, and add to the layer the expanded adverse childhood experiences, such as community violence, racism, bullying. And so all of these impact people, right? And how we show up in. So the things that I've noticed is that hypervigilance, control, and a lot of the things, they can take you so far, but they are not good coping strategies. If you're finding your self-worth, your self-esteem, and what gives you joy, right, by going after those titles or money, and fill in the blanks, right? So one of the things what we are seeing is the great resignation is also because people haven't dealt with their trauma. And now, with the work 24/7 being, on, and this is a big shift for many companies, but a lot of global companies were operating like that way before pandemic. And I have worked in some of those companies, like since mid 2000s. So for me, that wasn't different. I think in US we dealt with, it was a very developed workplace work market. So people had clean time they would take off. And over the years, like in terms of productivity gains, you feel the burnout, and which is why people are leaving. So, and besides, there are some, bad workplace policies in terms of worker protection or insurance or coverage, mental health coverage. I think a lot of that has contributed to this.
I think what you mentioned there is really interesting, and I never thought about it as being achievement as a trauma response. But I can see that if you never got that acknowledgement, or if you never had that feeling of control, right? As a survivor myself, sometimes I feel I have loss of control, which has led to things for me like eating disorder, or things where I feel I can totally control that. scenario. So it is interesting to see achievement, which is something we all praise, right? So that is a very interesting turn. So what are some of the, I guess, advice that you would give to someone that is using achievement in this kind, I guess, is it negative way, where you're pressuring yourself, right, to create achievement, not for positive, but for kind of a trauma support, I guess, right?
Yeah. So achievement is good, right? So a healthy amount of, desire, wanting, wanting to make impact and, use your our fullest potential. These are great things, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. But when we start to equate achievement or a certain, you get something and how as a measure of your self-worth, whether you are worthy of being seen, heard, loved, right, validated, that's not okay. And I think a lot of the trauma survivors, which they equate, and just the way even our corporate like performance management systems sometimes work, like the curve fitting, like your bottom 10% or top 10%, like that's a performance, right? Based on a certain point in time. So we somehow have equated, just think about from a child perspective, right? Who's surviving trauma, and trauma can be many different things. And in my case, it was childhood sexual abuse. In many cases it could be displacement, it could be other kinds of abuse, or many things, right? So, or workplace bullying, or toxicity, right? So racism. So as a result of that, you've had to work extra hard because sometimes you diminish yourself, or you're trying to see, like, tiptoe around people, right? Adults or caregivers who are supposed to help you. So you figure out, oh, in order to get out of this environment, I need to be doing well in my studies, I need to be getting into this college, or I need to be getting this amount of money, and then I am safe. And then guess what, you start working, and that spiral, like every time you don't get that promotion, or you don't get that title, or somebody else kind of tells you something, your that core sense of safety is threatened. Okay? So I think where that line gets blurry is, each of us are worthy, we are whole, we are loved, we are seen, and knowing that, trusting ourselves deeply, right? And breaking that pattern of not getting triggered when our achievement goes away, right? Otherwise, there comes a point in our life, either in our path to parenthood, or as we see our children grow, right, where we start feeling that disconnection.
Yeah, I think it's very true. Sometimes, I see the way in which my children are developing, or at that time point in their life, when my oldest daughter reached the age she was when I first had her, that is a very strange feeling, right? And it can trigger a lot of that trauma that you had at the time, and it's hard because you try to balance out and separate that from your family, but it does overlap quite often.
Yeah.
And so what I think is most interesting is this overlap also into work, because I think in the American culture, like I said, we try to divide everything, right? Everything's kind of siloed. Like my family life is here. Maybe my mental health and my psychology is over here, and then my work life is over here. So we're used to having these silos and not necessarily seeing that everything kind of overlaps, right? It's more of a Venn diagram than like separate circles. So if you could give one tip that would help us navigate this in the workplace, what would your one takeaway be? And of course, working through your company to get further guidance. But what would be a step to start?
Yeah, you mean tip for trauma survivors surviving in the workplaces? So I think knowing your triggers. I was just in a session earlier today, and we talked about adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And trauma can be, just know that trauma could be from many external, events, right? And then there's the individual response to it, like how you feel, how you what your emotions are. Or maybe it's happened long back and you're still carrying some of that trauma in your body, and trauma gets trapped in your at a cellular level, right? So, and then that there are implications of that on your health, your physiology, and how you show up at your workplaces. So knowing, what did you have any adverse childhood experiences, which is abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse or neglect, and then household dysfunction in terms of your either a divorce, a caregiver or close relative having mental health issues, an incarcerated relative, or seeing someone struggle with mental health, or essentially substance abuse, right? So
Mhm.
know that if you have 4 or more of those 10, then you are like many times more likely to have suicidal effects. I think 4.5 times more likely to have depression, and 12 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, right? So that, when I heard about that, and roughly a third of the adults have that, like 4 or more,
Yeah.
just depending on which demographic group you look at. So
Mhm.
it's very commonplace. ACEs are very commonplace, but know your ACEs, and then make sure that you are actually working either, and I don't care who you work with, right? Work with a trained, health, either mental health professional if you need to get that help. There are my company also creates spaces for executives and women who are trauma survivors, and still, despite their achievements, they are hiding behind their they're basically hiding the whole all of the trauma, right? I want to help them share their story and shift their identity from shame, blame, and guilt to show up boldly, because this is going to stop. So the tip really is to know yourself, right? And start your journey. The most foundational thing, I believe, starts with forgiveness of anything that might have abused you. And forgiveness, I don't mean that you forgive or absolve anyone of their responsibilities. What I mean is that incident or that thing that happened, it's in the past. The other person is probably not even wasting any moment or any energy. You are choosing to take that and recreate your reality and re-traumatize. So
Mhm.
forgiveness to really take back of your life, your personal power, essentially. And then rest will be easy to follow.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned how your body kind of holds on to trauma. And I think we see that in a lot of ways, even when we try to separate that from the work we do or from our personal family relationships. It finds a way. How can people get in touch with you, Kalpa, if they want to learn more about your organization and what you offer?
Sure, they can find me on LinkedIn. My full name is Kalpashree Gupta. So that's Kalpashree, and Gupta, Gupta. And or they can find our contact us to our website, which is, and somebody in my team will be in touch. It's KneKxt. It's KNEKXT.com. Or they can email me if they get in touch with my, through LinkedIn. I can share my more of the email, or if there are show notes, I can send all that. Right. So I would love to hear if anyone is, in that situation. I want them to know that you are not alone. You're not alone, no matter what kind of trauma you're facing. I mean, trauma is so commonplace. It's just that we don't talk about it. And I think there's a need, if anything, this pandemic, as the last 2 years have taught us, that we need to talk about it, share about it, and so that, it can help other people.
I agree. And I think, the thing about the pandemic is we've all become a little more vulnerable with each other. We've all kind of seen the human side of each other, even at work. And I hope that remains, because it's very powerful to work with people as humans instead of as robotic numbers to get the job done, right? It's more inclusive to think of all the people and the lives you're impacting. Well, thank you so much, Kalpa, for your time today. I hope we can talk again. I'd love to chat with you further about a lot of these deeper dive issues like trauma in the workplace. I will link the book you mentioned in the comments. And again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining.